Hi friends, welcome back, and I know that as soon as I say this maybe people will trickle back in, so welcome back. At this time I'd like to recognize Cyril O'Regan, who is the Catherine Husking Professor of Systematic Theology here at the University of Notre Dame, and he is going to introduce our speaker.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor David Walsh, political philosopher, general philosopher, and professor of political science at Catholic University of America. Professor Walsh is a prolific author. He is the author of the imposing trilogy, After Ideology, Recovering the Spiritual Foundations of Freedom, 1990, The Growth of the Liberal Soul, 1997, and The Modern Philosophical Revolution, 2008. Now, this trilogy is imposing not simply because of the size of the volumes, which vary between 400 and 650 pages, but more because of their intellectual heft. The trilogy attempts nothing less than examining of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment discourses in terms of their relative novelty and also their origins in pre-modern discourses, and also critically assessing them in terms of where they correct, develop, and also fall short of pre-modern philosophical and religious discourses. If in the trilogy we are not quite talking about a Charles Taylor waving on of modern discourses, neither are we talking about a calculated nostalgia for the pre-modern as entirely satisfactory in terms of its discourses, practices, and forms of life. Nothing therefore remotely of an anti-modern screed. Instead, a meticulous examination of losses and gains regarding the understanding of the self, history, the good, and the proper goal of politics. Other areas of inquiry both abstract from and develop aspects of this larger philosophical historical frame. David has written a number of books which attempt to provide conceptual clarity to the notion of the person, even if the discourse of the person has similar liabilities to that of human dignity. He published a book on the cusp of the millennium on this topic, and his most recent statement is The Politics of the Person, Notre Dame Press, this year or last year. In addition, Professor Walsh is a Berglund Scholar of the First Rank and has edited 3 of the volumes that make up the collected works, and also has written numerous essays. Berglund is a major influence regarding the areas of interest and inquiry, but Walsh distinguishes himself from him in terms both of tone and in terms of nuance and measure in interpreting the ideological fabric of modernity. David and I are both Irish and also old friends. I think we sometimes resemble 2 characters in a vaudeville comic production by Samuel Beckett, in that both of us are supposed to be world experts on things no sane person would want to be experts on. For instance, the theosophy of Jakob Böhme or the alchemical thought of the Renaissance. Now, last night, David averred that he knew me before I had a single publication. This is true. Overnight, and for want of a better thing to do, I busied myself with extracting meaning from this unelicited declaration. I think David's point was a question. How human can you be in an academic culture without publication? Can rights of value or the prospect of human flourishing be ascribed to you? I was hoping that David might address this topic today. Fortunately, however, he is not. Professor Walsh's paper deals with the problem of defining and placing human dignity in a conceptual field that is proper to it. His rather tantalizing suggestion is that human dignity is an eschatological concept. Professor David Walsh.
very much, Cyril, for a very kind introduction. And we'll see what we can do about filling in the gaps in your past, maybe later on. Things that perhaps even you don't recall quite so well. At any rate, let me begin by thanking John Cavadini and the Institute for Church Life, Jessica, and the organizers of this conference. It's always a great pleasure to return to Notre Dame, where I've spent many happy days, and share some thoughts on an area of common interest. I think this is a fabulous topic for a conference, and it's in a sense a non-academic topic, because the topic of human dignity is one that engages all of us at one level or another, or sooner or later. The questions around human dignity are really questions about ourselves and questions that affect ourselves. It's in a sense too important to be left merely to lawyers, politicians, and perhaps media types, or whoever, the commentariat in general. We all have a responsibility to think about and clarify our minds on human dignity. And sometimes we're required to do it when we're least expecting it. At any rate, my title, as Cyril said, was Dignity as an Eschatological Concept. And the last time I tried this out was in a largely legal audience, and they were totally baffled. So since we have slightly more theologians here, I'm pretty certain that, at least I can get to first base on this as an issue. So far in our conversation this morning, which I've been following with great interest, the topic of dignity has been approached with a kind of intense awareness that we lack the philosophical, we lack in a sense the metaphysical framework, or the metaphysical hardware to really address it. And Sister Anne's paper that we just listened to reminded me again of that challenge, because Levinas and Marcel, who are both prominent in terms of contributors to thinking about this problem, seem indeed studiously to avoid anything having to do with ontology or metaphysics. And I can understand that, and it's for good reasons and so on. But what I want to suggest is indeed that the framework of the person may provide us with a way out. And in my thinking about the person over the last 10 years or so, it has become apparent to me that the person is really the missing entity in Western thought, including from the very beginning in terms of the Christological and Trinitarian dogmas, where the term substance, hypostasis, is used in preference to prosopon, the person. The prosopon is, of course, the mask that was carried by the Greek actors, and it carries, I think, exactly what we want to say about the person, as what's there and not there at the same time. Substance doesn't do that. Substance already gets us down into this kind of difficult area where we're beginning to think, is there anything there deep down? The question that Richard Rorty and people like this ask, and the various critics of the term human dignity, that dignity is an unusable concept as such. Now, that's in a sense by way of preliminary. My other preliminary is to suggest that even though we are talking comfortably about human dignity, and it's a universal kind of term of reference in the world, it's almost entirely absent from the American legal tradition. I've forgotten who I was talking to about this last night. I think it was Clemens. And we were mentioning this, that there's a good reason why dignity is prevalent today and absent from the American regime, from the American political and legal tradition. And that is because the American legal tradition, the constitutional tradition of America, is an old one. Whereas all of the constitutions that mention human dignity are much more recent. They're recent constitutions. In the 18th century and the Philadelphia Convention and the First Congress, there's really no mention. Nobody speaks up for human dignity. Their language is the language of rights. And it's, I think, worth keeping in mind that that sort of transition from the language of rights to the language of dignity, and perhaps back again, is still an open question. Whether a reference to dignity does indeed best protect our rights or not. I know that's thrown into the newer constitutions, the German one and the Constitution of Israel and others, but jurists don't seem to be fully convinced that it works as a legal framework or as a legal protection. Those are, I think, some of the background issues that we should keep in mind. Let me just begin with my paper, though, which I'll read as far as I can and keep an eye on the clock so we have time for some discussion. An eschatological concept is one that cannot be fully known because we live within it. One day its meaning will be disclosed, but for now we see through it last darkly. Human dignity is such a concept because it says what we cannot fully say. That is, that each human being is sacrosanct. There is a zone of inviolability we must not cross because it would be to deny the very meaning of what it is to be a person. As one who holds his or her existence in their own hands, we must not take that away by treating them as objects of control. Autonomy is too thin a word for what autonomy identifies. It is the whole metaphysical significance of the person that is at issue when we confront the question of human dignity. Our difficulty is that we live in a world without metaphysics, and therefore we have to say what cannot be said. I know the Cardinal last night beautifully referenced the biblical sources, and certainly that is a primary resource for us. But we can never lose sight of the fact that the Church has always adopted a philosophical language. And today, where there's no adequate philosophical language available, we face a challenge. This paper takes up the challenge by pointing to eschatology as the horizon of saying, because it is the horizon of our existence. Of course, I'm probably using eschatology in a somewhat idiosyncratic way here, and under my First Amendment rights that I occasionally exercise, I can make words mean what I want them to mean. We begin by reflecting on what it means to live with an understanding we do not fully penetrate, and thereby enlarge the possibility of truth. That's the first part of the paper, which is on, you could say, the primacy of the practical. Then we examine the regime of rights, that is, our authoritative moral language, yet one that acknowledges its own incompleteness. When pressed to explain what rights are imputed to defend, our rights talk can only point to the dignity of the person. That is why the topic of human dignity has in the last few decades surfaced with new prominence. You could say the UN Universal Declaration of Rights has, in a sense, been revisited with this kind of explosion of interest in the topic of human dignity, as if the Declaration of Rights was always deficient or incomplete in a way that we couldn't endure. The problem third then is that dignity, and the third part of the paper, dignity proves more elusive than its invocation might suggest, because it protects what is most invisible of all. That is, the true self, that even the person, him or herself, never fully apprehends. In avoiding metaphysics, we have evoked it more deeply. That's one of the paradoxical things about metaphysics. We cannot deny, finally, in the fourth part, that dignity derives from the transcendence of the person, by which each of us approaches the transcendence of God. Human dignity names our capacity to go beyond the claim to dignity through total self-emptying. It is thus what constitutes the transcendence of the person and can never really be lost. Gilbert Meilander mentioned some of that this morning. That is why, most of all, it must be preserved, as the framework of rights has continually sought to do, even without mentioning it. Okay, the primacy of the practical. This is, of course, the point where I have to mention that one of the advantages of being a political scientist is that we deal with things that are actually working, more or less, long before anybody understands why they work, or what the justifications for their operation is. We begin by noting that the notion of dignity has migrated from a social sphere where the assertion of status was all important to one in which it is precisely the capacity to transcend any status that is the central issue, from dignity as a role to something universally human. Rather than a world-immanent concept, dignity has become an eschatological proclamation. Each one of us exceeds the whole world because we are called to exceed all limits in self-giving. There is no worldly limit to our capacity to love. It is that eschatological flash that we glimpse when we glimpse the reality of the person, or rather the non-reality of the person who transcends every boundary assigned in advance. The inexhaustibility of the person, the inwardness within which everything is contained, is familiarly intuited in the persons we know. We might say that we hardly know them until we encounter them as individual abysses of unknowability. That is why we cannot know persons except personally. Then we at least gain a sense of each person's unique unfathomability. The problem is that we have no philosophical language that can access that mutuality of persons that is more than words can say. We know it, everybody knows this, but there's no words that say it. It concedes the death of metaphysics, the opaqueness of the language of substance, as well as the language of God, and betrays worse, philosophy itself has failed in this task, and philosophy has, in a sense, embraced the death of metaphysics and the opaqueness of all of our language. But this is where politics enters on the scene. In the political realm, philosophical limits cannot define the human limits. We cannot await the theoretical breakthroughs that would prove sufficiently compelling. We must forge a meaning from the remnants that still retain the evocative moral authority that wins our consent. In politics, we do not agree on foundations and then erect the principles by which a publicly representative order is affirmed. The theoretical comprehension arises later and follows the practice. Before we reflect on whence we've come and where we're going and so on, we're already bound by certain moral and political convictions with which we cannot dispense. Truthfulness cannot be grounded unless we are prepared to do so truthfully. All discussion begins with prior moral commitments. Loyalty cannot be discussed until we are pledged to its requirement. That is why politics is always in advance of its philosophy, and the prayer life of the church is prior to its theology. What theoretical reflection provides is not the first principles of what it examines, but a meditation on what it finds as already obliging its own exercise. Philosophy can never contain that wherein it too is contained. It is bound by the primacy of the practical that receives its public authorization only within politics. A case in point is the unsurpassability of human rights. The mutual recognition of rights is not only entailed within the logic of discourse in general, but is even more deeply entailed within the moral imperative of the human community. It is difficult, if not impossible, for us to conceive of a human community that would not value each and every member as unique, irreplaceable, and immeasurable. Of course, we know of societies that do so, but we must regard them as perverse. What is decisive, however, is that we cannot conceive of any higher notion of community than one that puts the neediest members first. That is, one whose rights are in any instance most in need of defending. This does not mean that every member is preoccupied with the protection of rights and the assertion of their individual interests, but it's the reciprocity that a regime of rights requires consists in the mutual restraint by which rights of all are recognized. Rights are permissive, they are not unlimited claims. We are free to exercise them or not, but we are not free to abrogate them in others. It may indeed be that in defending my rights, I defend the rights of all, and that when the rights of one are threatened, the rights of all are placed in jeopardy, but this is not a prescription for collective self-interest, contrary to an often prevailing view. Our interests are served only within a regime founded on fairness, because it is only then that the right to what each is owed is sufficiently guaranteed. Interest is served only when justice takes precedence. A system of rights is the way in which this relationship gains recognition. Its discovery, however, has largely been the fruit of historical practice for which the theoretical justification continued to lag. The pattern is detailed in Brian Tierney's book, The Idea of Natural Right, which I warmly recommend to you, which traces the rise of natural rights outside of medieval political theory to show that rights can be invoked within any expansive theoretical framework. The canonists distinguished between the ownership of property and its use, and thereby established the notion of a right from which others could be excluded. It was only a small step for William of Ockham to establish the idea of a right that could not be alienated in his dispute with John XXII over Franciscan poverty. The most that the vow of poverty could entail is a renunciation of the legal right to property, since the natural right to the use of property for the sake of life could never be renounced. This is why if you see a Franciscan eating his lunch, you can walk over and take it away from him. And he can have no legal grounds for complaint because he's taken a vow and not to object to that. He could claim that you've deprived him of his natural right, but not of his legal right, since he doesn't own property. This was at least the very odd place in which this notion that there are certain rights that you cannot simply even renounce legally gets developed. So it's in a practical realm, a world in which disputes and controversies are getting worked out, that some of these most important and precious ideas arise. From there, the idea migrated to the conciliarist disputes in which the right of the church and of any community to govern itself could not be renounced. This in turn created difficulty for the Spanish monarchy in the 16th century, when Victoria and the Spanish scholastics insisted that the conquest of the Americas had not abrogated the natural rights of the Indians to property and self-government. In other words, long before political theory had begun its quest for the foundations of rights, the discourse had emerged in practical disputes in which inalienability had become starkly visible. Okay. That's the way in which practice introduces certain ideas that become pivotal. Second, dignity as the invisible source of rights. To call these subjective rights, as even Tierney does, is to suggest they have no other basis than the mere assertion of claims. But they are not subjective in this relativist sense. Rather, they are simply the result of adopting the perspective of the person affected, the individual subject whose humanity is under threat. In effect, they are objective rights, the ineradicable rights that attach to a human being simply in virtue of his or her humanity, without subtraction or addition. When all else is lost or renounced, they are the rights that remain to denote the inexhaustibility of the person. The problem is that the source of that inexhaustibility remains strangely invisible. We are hard-pressed to locate what cannot be located, or to measure what cannot be measured. It is only in the heightened vitality of the disputes in which the notion of natural rights arises that their imprescriptible reality is clearly glimpsed. Once the high drama, this is why, of course, dissident movements everywhere in the world become the great inspiration for everybody who admires the notion of rights. Once we have them, we don't bother defending them, and we tend to overlook them. Once the high drama of defense is passed, rights recede into the inaccessible. It is no wonder they generate a rich trail of theoretical adumbrations, even if none have succeeded in establishing their formulations definitively. And more recently, that awareness of intellectual fragility has begun to surface within the practical realm in which the priority of rights must be implemented. It is no accident that the UN Universal Declaration of Rights simultaneously avoids any indication of the source of justification of rights, while also invoking the substantive notion of human dignity as their background. And this is partly why that you could say this sense of the incompleteness of the language of rights points many other thinkers and societies today to re-examine the notion of dignity. The same pattern is repeated in these other constitutions that we mentioned. Over the past 25 years, dignity has become pervasive in charters and courts as they concede the insufficiency of our rights jurisprudence. Dignity is required to name what must be preserved over and above the preservation of rights. Only if it is named can the source of rights be adequately guarded. At least that's the sense, the intuition. The difficulties that this movement beyond the specificity of rights generates are readily accepted as the price that must be paid for what is priceless. It is an impressive testament to deeper resonances within liberal discourse. Where philosophy has failed and religion has been unable to generalize its insights, the law must invoke what cannot readily be invoked. Dignity is surely the most elusive concept of all. Its presence within legal briefs and judicial opinions signals a felt need that is otherwise utterly unmet within the public square. Somehow, the harm that the deprivation of rights inflicts must be resisted, not just in the name of what is right, but in relation to what the right seeks to shield. The evolution was amply displayed in the thought of Immanuel Kant, who was the one who introduced the notion of universal human dignity, in contrast to prior conceptions of dignity as specific to a particular office or station in life. That's not completely the case, but Kant is certainly the one who elevates the notion of human dignity and doesn't get much credit for it, let's face it. Kant did lots of things for which he didn't necessarily get all the credit he deserved. But this is certainly one of those areas. Rather than the dignity of what is visible, Kant would turn our attention toward the dignity that exceeds all visibility. Kant may not be thinking juristically, but the same inexorability is at work in both cases. When one thinks about the respect that is owed to each human being, we realize that it cannot be limited to the finite contribution each has made. Entitlement to dignity is by virtue of his or her humanity, for the case of each person. The sharp distinction we have made between the social status and human status begins to melt away as we realize that the latter is the ground of the former. There are no pure role players. All are persons who first possess the dignity of persons. It is their integrity as persons, their inwardness, that the notion of dignity seeks to guard. Rights are merely the external defenses against the infringement of what is, strictly speaking, internal. This is, of course, what makes the protection of dignity so notoriously difficult. because what may be an infringement to one may not be so to another. Dignity is not contained in any of the codifiable attributes that make a legal code possible. What may be an insupportable burden to one may be a matter of indifference to another. A prohibition against turbans falls more heavily on Sikh men than on the rest of the gender, just as a ban on headscarves affects Muslim women differently than other women. In each case, it is not the specific character of the burden that is at issue, but the way in which it infringes upon the inner freedom of the person to be themselves. Without intending it, requirements that on their face may be trivial or neutral can have the effect of abrogating the most sacrosanct imperative of self-determination. Of course, each individual remains capable of an interior refusal to obey, but they cannot manifest that within the external world. They are deprived of the possibility of presenting themselves in public, which is more than the loss of what they would present. It is the denial of the self as the source of all self-presentation. To denigrate or diminish that innermost self, the self from which all self-expression arises, while itself remaining beyond expression, is to strike at the core of the person. It is to deny the dignity of that which enacts its own being. This is the awesome stature of the person for whom no one is entitled to speak but the person, him or herself. The person denied does not disappear, but is prevented from appearing. It is the objectification of what cannot and should not be objectified. But what of the possibility that the person might choose that path of diminished personhood? This was in many ways the problem that troubled Kant, that people might use their autonomy to throw away their autonomy, to enslave themselves. Dignity, this is my third part, dignity as invisible. This was the great difficulty that Kant intuited and struggled against. Indeed, his whole discourse about human dignity can be read as a protracted effort to heighten the awareness of dignity as a bulwark against its deliberate devaluation. Kant too needs the idea of dignity and can't do without it. His whole morality of self-determination and autonomy implies that autonomy preserves something worth preserving and exercises something worth exercising as not just simply an empty formal thing. That notion of Kant as a pure formalist is really one of the worst charges made against him. Even when we must allow ourselves to be used as objects, as in Kant's strange conception of marriage, we must take steps to ensure that the person is not reduced to that status. Marriage is the only way that the sexual relationship of men and women can affirm that they are more than what they do. In marriage, the partners are received as wholes and never as parts. The person who presents him or herself to the other is acknowledged as what can never be fully presented. That is what is absent from the contract of prostitution. Even the term carries disavowal within it, for in that case, the partners have only presented themselves in the form of economic exchange. Any service that entails the whole person cannot be reduced to the coin of barter. Persons can engage in economic exchanges precisely because they cannot exchange themselves. An economy requires persons who stand outside of it as enactors of the freedom that makes it all possible. The person who remains beyond every action can neither be subsumed into the transaction nor excluded from it. Dignity is the path by which what cannot be said, what can neither be preserved nor abolished, is irrefutably displayed. Autonomy, Kant discovered, cannot be cannot be exercised in disregard of its own meaning. What remains to be discovered is how self-determination is bounded by what it makes possible. In the absence of any comprehensive philosophical defense of the dignity of the person, we must be particularly alert to the insights that are generated in the field of practice. I'll just skip over that discussion in the interest of time so that we can get to essentially what's the last section, that persons transcend all saying and doing. Perhaps it is time to shed the connection that the term dignity has with any notion of status. Granted that it has already eliminated the vestiges of special status in favor of a universal human status from which no one is excluded, but this still may suggest something too worldly. It leaves something tangible, even if it is universally human, on which the person may stake his or her dignity. In doing so, however, we betray the dignity of the person which does not turn on any particular features or qualities the person may possess. Even the dignity of a rational being, so important to Kant, seems to suggest that it must be accorded only so long as we retain the capacity to reason. This is, of course, the error into which the inclination to define what it means to be a person, and therefore an agent of dignity, inevitably leads. It is not what we intend in invoking the term human dignity, for we mean precisely the opposite of any scale of measurement. Even those who fall short of displaying their full personhood are somehow persons, and we affirm this in according them the dignity of persons. We do not ask them to produce proof of personhood. Instead, we are inclined to conclude that they most of all are persons, for they allow us to relate directly to them in all their invisibility. By saying nothing, they have said everything. They show that above all, persons are, most of all, when they are not expressed in anything present. Even without consciousness, they give themselves through their breathing until they yield up their last. Theirs is the dignity of having yielded all, and we realize that there is nothing in which they can be contained. It's one of the great mysteries, the idea of the person. That the person is not contained in anything. This is why we reverence their remains as what still speak to us even after the person is gone. Not even death can defeat the person who somehow is deathless. That is why the distinctive mark of all human societies is remembrance of the dead. We are inclined to think that thinking about the afterlife is the result of religion, but it is really the opposite, the converse. Religion arises because we already know about the afterlife through our experience as persons, who are never fully here and therefore are never fully departed. To be a person is to be transcendent. We therefore know about the transcendent, God, only because we participate in that mode of being. Whatever we have said or done, we have gone beyond it as that which can never be identical with the said or done. Persons thus exist nowhere. It is futile to ask for a metaphysics of the person, as if anything more substantive could explain the transcendence of the person. We can understand metaphysics, the possibility of transcendence, because we are persons capable of containing the whole world inwardly, only because we are not present within it. This is the Imago Dei, although the formula already suffers from the defect of suggesting that there is a likeness for what has no likeness. But the term also works because it shows that we have been able to glimpse the transcendent by virtue of our own transcendence. God can be known only by persons who are God-like. That is their dignity. They are beyond any claim to dignity in this world. It is the dignity of those whose dignity does not turn on any display of dignity. They hold their dignity within their own hands and can freely take it up or surrender it. For this reason, it does not arise from our acknowledgement. They cannot lose it, although we may fail to stand within its imperative. The dignity of persons is that they are deathless, that they stand outside of all that they are. They cannot lose what never is. That is why, no matter what indignity they may suffer, they can never lose their dignity. Of course, a human being may lose control, may be overwhelmed by suffering and devastation, but that is only a possibility for one who is not defined by the extremity of misery. Only persons can suffer because they are not identical with pain. Animals are engulfed in their pain, This is why we put them out of their pain. We cannot do that for a human being who always remains beyond the pain he or she undergoes. It is why they have faith, a faith by which their suffering is transcendence. This is exemplified by Christ, who not only lays aside the dignity of God to become man, but even sets aside the prerogatives of a human being through his death on a cross. It is a death utterly without dignity because it is public. Crucifixion is certainly among the most excruciating ways to die, but it is intensified when it is undergone before a hostile public gaze. The innermost agony of the person is exposed. That moment when the person is at his most vulnerable, the precious loss of life that must be shielded from the stare of indifferent onlookers, has been ripped open. What should be observed only by those who can share in the suffering of the dying is exhibited for all to see. Not only is death inflicted, but the person is annihilated as a person. I think that question came up earlier on today, whether that's possible. The interior life is denied when it is objectified. Yet it is the way willingly undergone by Jesus. He not only suffered and died, but did so in such a way that he abandoned all human dignity. Yet he simultaneously regained all that had been lost. In giving himself up, shedding not only the last drop of blood, but also the last vestige of human dignity, Christ showed the real character of human dignity. It is the dignity of yielding up one's dignity completely. It is the dignity of God that carries nothing of self-concern within it, but freely gives itself on behalf of all. No greater triumph over evil is possible than the divine action in which God sacrifices himself completely. Nor is there any greater meaning to human dignity than the capacity to share in that total outpouring that is the life of God. This is why human dignity is an eschatological concept. It cannot be described in the terminology of this world, where it has exceeded every finite measurement. It is the dignity of the immeasurable, the dignity of that which has renounced all claims to dignity. That is its dignity. It is the dignity of what is beyond dignity. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So friends, the floor is open.
Thank you very much. Chad Pecknold, Catholic University, and sometimes colleagues have to go elsewhere in order to talk to each other, so it's good to ask you a question. I have one observation and then a question. The observation is that the rights discourse that we observe in the liberal tradition is, as you say, permissive. Permissive of self-determination, permissive of self-expression. The older rights concept has to do with participation in common good, which I think is pretty relevant to this discussion about human dignity, that it has a teleological force to it, right? That rights in the older tradition have in it the assumption that individual rights primarily are teleological for participation in the common good. And I suppose I say that's just a comment that maybe you might comment on my comment. So that's part one. The other thing to say is the quite beautiful reflections on persons as transcendent, and your reflections are quite beautiful related to death. And death is the occasion for considering the transcendence of the person. But today is the Feast of the Annunciation. And I wonder if we might also think about St. Thomas and his observations that it's actually the self-evidentiary quality of the first precepts have to do with life and birth, that we have a natural inclination to exist, that we have a natural inclination to multiply and propagate the human race. Another first precept is that we have a natural inclination to know God, to know the truth about God. And that these are all movements towards life, towards birth, towards growth, that also show the transcendence of the person. And I wonder if you might push back to what you're pushing towards death is disclosive of the transcendence of the person. But would you push on this Feast of Annunciation to something prior?
All right. Thanks very much. Yeah. Let me begin with the first one, which is about rights and the common good. Yes, I agree that that's in large part where the language of rights comes from, or at least one of the contexts in which it comes from. But I don't think that the priority of the assertion of individual rights necessarily is in tension or in conflict with any notion of the common good. You know, there's a lot of bad rap about the idea of rights. Probably the most prominent thinker is John Locke, and almost everywhere you look for an account of Locke, everybody refers to him as an individualist. He says that, and this is what's echoed in the Declaration of Independence, that government exists to protect life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson changes that to the pursuit of happiness. And that sounds like a very individualistic perspective. But in fact, when you read Locke, you realize that Locke is continually evoking the idea of community, and that indeed a regime of rights is a reciprocal regime in which I recognize your rights and you recognize my rights. Now, yes, at one level that seems like an individualistic contract and exchange, and the language of contract is applied to it. But over and above that, we have entered into a community with one another. And that takes priority over our, you could say, individual perspectives. So the language of rights is in its nature communitarian rather than individualistic. Our greatest theologian of rights, John Rawls, has exactly the same notion of reciprocity as the fundamental basis for any mutual regime of mutual respect for rights of one another, political liberalism and all of that. And this is a fairly continuous thing. Certainly in the classical world, in the Greek world and the Roman world, the emphasis on the common good takes priority. But gradually, it comes to be recognized that there's really no priority. There's no common good other than the good of the individual members of any society. It's the good of each person that takes priority. There's no kind of collective purpose or collective good. Even when we use that language of the common good, it sounds almost as if, well, we've got a project that we're all working towards and everybody has to play their part in it. But civil society, civil association is really about its individual members. There's no higher good than the good of each individual. That's what this transcendent perspective signifies too. So I don't think that that's necessarily in tension or in conflict. Whether the second part of your question, Chad, about transcendence as carrying other tonalities besides death and going beyond, yes. Prior to it, yes. We are never really talking about death and dying, because our whole activity here is to live. Death is in a sense outside of it. So there's no kind of turning away from the vitality of life and of our responsibilities toward flourishing in this life and so on, the flourishing of one another. Those are, you could say, I don't mean to characterize them as purely mundane goals. They are indeed mundane goals that have a larger significance than even they can contain. So that's in a sense the promise that's contained in the Annunciation and everything else that we think of as life-affirming and generative of that more expansionary account of things. I'm not sure that one of the odd features of our world is that we live in a world that forgets what's beyond it, and therefore it carries this enormous burden of everything. All of the significance of a human life must somehow be achieved or realized within this time and place. That's in many ways not only a trap but a dead end. The problem with most of the project of civilization and of development and everything else is that we eventually have to deal with its futility. And that isn't necessarily a negative. That actually is a liberating aspect. To find the right balance where what you're engaged with is perhaps not going to achieve the goals that you intended, but that it nevertheless carries within that a kind of larger significance than we can fully absorb.
So I have a question too.
The director's prerogative.
Well, I have 5 minutes. I was very moved by your depiction of the crucifixion, as an instance where someone willingly, I guess you could say, embraced the loss of all dignity and thereby affirmed human dignity in some way. Anyway, that was very moving to me, and I take it to heart. It also traces this fourth servant song, that we hear on Good Friday, though he had no stately bearing, and though he had nothing that would cause us to look at him. But it leaves me with one worry that sneaks up, even as I'm thinking about all of that, because in a sense, the one who opened not his mouth and was led to slaughter like a sheep before the shearers has in that very act of will a dignity, in a sense that we can recognize. And this reminds me, this is just a comment, this reminds me of a passage from Origen in the On First Principles where he talks about the wondrous nature of God's divine nature, the Son's divine nature. But how what surpasses wonder is that such a nature towering above all others could have entered into a woman's womb and been born and uttered crying noises just like any other child. And then he goes on to say, and submit to the most humiliating death. But that first moment, I think, in some ways is worse for Origen than the end of it. Because a baby has absolutely no dignity and has no consciousness of renouncing dignity. Of course, the two things work together, but it's interesting that Origen, I think, puts his weight on that first one.
Yeah. No, that's a very helpful observation, and it helps to kind of expand what we mean by dignity. And this is one of the problems of that term. That once you begin. All of this terminology that we're using, liberty, rights, autonomy, dignity, and all of that, they are only abbreviations. And it's very important to keep that in mind, that abbreviations are a wonderful way of generating a kind of public consensus or a collective direction, a commitment, and so on. This was the UN Declaration. It's just a set of abbreviations. What's underneath is, a large iceberg that is we only gradually discern what it's about and so on. So yes, that's a great observation. Steve.
I have a question. Aside from whether one is talking about the common good
Yeah.
or individual good,
Yeah.
this is a follow-up on the previous question. There must be somehow a connection to what is good and what is not good. There must be a teleology there. What bothers me about, I don't know if you're defending the Kantian idea, but what bothers me about the idea of dignity as flowing from simply from self-determination is it has a certain vacuity to it. So you mentioned that forbidding a Sikh man to wear a turban infringes his dignity because it infringes his self-determination. Similarly, a Muslim woman not allowed to wear a headscarf infringes on self-determination. But I don't think we would say that a law forbade public nudity, which also infringes self-determination.
Right.
That's not an assault on dignity. And it seems to me you have to be able to say why one is an assault on dignity and illegitimate, and the other is legitimate. And you can't do that without some teleology. What is clothing for? What is the meaning of nudity? What is the meaning? And so you have to get into some substance about human nature and what is good for human nature, either as an individual good or as a common good. And I think that somehow this Kantian idea seems stripped of all substance because it's unrelated to ends. That's just my...
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's an obvious question that the position that I'm really laying out, has to answer. It's not necessarily the case that all of those specific examples have a resolution. There may simply be conflicts. I mean, the famous dwarf tossing cases were, are really impressive. One where, on the one hand, these dwarfs had not only volunteered but contracted to be tossed, and they were legally prohibited from engaging in their profession. Who defines dignity if not the person, him or herself? So there is a kind of, you could say, inevitability of conflict over issues like that. I'm less concerned with being able to resolve all of those questions than with having a kind of approach, an approach that I wouldn't say relies on self-determination as the main thing, although that's a very that's a frequently invoked language. It's really the language of self-presentation, so that it's not really a question of whether you have the liberty to do what you want to do, but whether indeed you can be who you want to be. So it's not it's more than just simply a free choice or an exercise of choice. It's a deeper aspect, and so what that does then is it kind of introduces a greater sort of depth to the nature of the questions. That they're not. I mean, they cannot simply be disposed of by saying, well, look, we have a law that there's no headgear allowed, and that applies to everybody equally, no matter what you wear. No, we are saying, look, if it is a matter of deep significance for you, then we ought to do whatever we can to, you could say, mitigate its impact. And this is basically what we're talking about as the right of conscientious objectors. Laws that are neutral may affect different groups differently, and the practice, nobody has a right to have their conscientious objections protected. There's no reason why people who are pacifists can't be required to serve the state. and even if necessary, be put into military service. It's a good idea that they're not. It's kind of counterproductive anyway. But it's, if everybody has to play their part, the idea that some people don't get to play their part at all is really not coherent or consistent. But on the other hand, we do recognize that each of us is not merely a citizen and a member of this whole that serves the common good, but that indeed we're part of a community that goes further than what the law requires. What's legally required may be different from what's morally, in a sense, expected of us. And that's in essence where this language is a little bit different from the language of rights and common good. Okay.
Well, Rick or Rick, do you have a really quick question?
Regardless of that.
Well, take me half an hour to be to. No, I can make the question.
Okay, since you got quick, not quick.
Well, just quick comment. I thought you were going to say when I read the title,
Yeah.
meaning that the eschatological meaning of human dignity was found also in that common good on earth, communities on earth aren't ever perfect. The only thing that is a true whole at this side of the eschaton is the person, and everything else that we usually refer to as a whole is not a whole, is not a perfect whole, whether it be the universe or the perfect communities or the state or the church. Would you agree with that, or is that part of the discourse?
Yeah, that's part of it, but that's in a sense the more conventional part, and so we try not to deal with the conventional. We try to deal with the unexpected.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.